Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. This time, we're going to be looking into ICE detention facilities. It's something I know a lot of you have been curious about, and we found some pretty interesting information in a recent article.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so the article we're looking at is from CBS News. It was published February 4th, 2025. And right away, they hit us with this really surprising statistic: ICE detention centers. You ready for this? They're operating at 109% capacity.
Wow.
Right?
That's crazy. I mean, something's got to give when they're that overcrowded, right?
Yeah, you would think.
So the article talks about how ICE is actually releasing detainees to try and manage the overcrowding. In some cases, they're letting dozens of people go every day.
It's kind of counterintuitive, right? If they have all these people detained, why would they release them?
That's what I thought, too.
I mean, we have to think about the political situation, though.
Okay, yeah.
President Trump just reinstated those stricter immigration policies.
Oh, right. Those are similar to what he did during his first administration.
Right. And so ICE is making a lot more arrests. That makes sense. The article actually mentions that right now, ICE is detaining close to 42,000 people, but their official capacity is only 38,521 beds.
Wow. So that's a difference of like what? Almost 3,500 people?
Yeah, exactly.
And remember, under the Biden administration, they were only averaging about 312 arrests each day.
Right.
Now, under Trump, they think that number could be as high as 1,000 a day.
Wow, that's a huge difference. But okay, this is what I don't get. If Trump's whole goal is to deport people on a large scale, then why are they releasing detainees at all?
Well, it's not quite that simple. Processing deportations takes a lot of time. There are all sorts of legal procedures and logistical hurdles. Sometimes detainees can legally challenge their deportation,
Oh,
or
okay.
they could even be granted relief by an immigration judge. So ICE can't just hold everyone indefinitely.
So it's way more complicated than it seems on the surface.
Hmm.
The article mentions that ICE is looking into different ways to deal with this whole situation.
I bet.
Like they want more funding and they're trying to set up partnerships with local law enforcement agencies.
Makes sense. They need more resources to deal with this.
Yeah, I guess.
But here's the thing. The article also says that border crossings are at a 5-year low.
So they're trying to increase detention even though fewer people are crossing the border.
Exactly. It seems kind of backwards.
It really does. So the article talks about some of ICE's expansion plans.
Oh, wow. What are they thinking of doing?
So first they're considering adding 14 new detention centers. Each one would hold 1,000 people.
Hmm.
But wait, there's more. They're also thinking about building 4 larger facilities.
How large are we talking?
Each of these would hold 10,000 people.
Wow, that's a lot of people.
I know, right? And get this, they're even considering using a Space Force base for detention.
A space for a space? That seems a little out there.
Yeah, and wait for it. Guantanamo Bay.
Guantanamo, seriously?
Yeah,
That's going to be controversial.
I know, right? Especially when you consider that the article says Border Patrol facilities are only operating at 9% capacity.
Yeah, why not just use those facilities?
Right.
I mean, I guess there are logistical challenges.
So,
And Border Patrol facilities aren't as secure as ICE detention centers.
right. I mean, you're kind of comparing apples and oranges. But still, it seems like there are a lot of moving parts here.
Yeah, it's a complicated situation.
With the border crossings down, but ICE wanting to increase detention. And they're looking at these really controversial solutions.
It's a tangled web, for sure.
Yeah,
I'm curious to hear more about their reasoning behind all this.
me too. Let's dig into that a little deeper. Okay, so we've been talking a lot about the overall picture with ICE detention. But I think it's important to remember that this is affecting real people you know. What does the article say about the detainees themselves?
Yeah, that's a really important point. The article doesn't go into a ton of detail, but it does mention that a lot of these people, they weren't picked up at the border. They were apprehended during routine ICE operations.
So this isn't just about border security. This is about ICE operating within communities all across the country.
Right, exactly.
Hmm.
It shows how their reach goes way beyond the border.
Yeah. And what does that mean for families who might have been living here in the U.S. for years?
Well, think about it. These families have built lives here, they have jobs, they have kids in school, and suddenly ICE can just come in and disrupt everything.
It's like their whole world gets turned upside down.
Yeah, and detention can have huge consequences, not just for the individual, but for their whole family.
Definitely. And I think we also need to talk about the psychological effects of being detained.
Oh, absolutely. It's an incredibly stressful experience. Being locked up, separated from your loved ones, not knowing what's going to happen to you, it
Yeah.
can really take a toll on your mental and emotional well-being.
I can't even imagine. And then there's the issue of the conditions in these detention centers, especially with the overcrowding. how can they possibly be providing adequate care?
That's a huge concern. We've seen so many reports over the years about inadequate medical care, substandard living conditions, even allegations of abuse.
Awful.
And when you add overcrowding into the mix, it just makes everything worse.
It's really concerning.
It makes you question whether detention should even be used as a primary enforcement tool.
Yeah, if we're going to detain people, we have to make sure they're being treated humanely.
Absolutely. We have a moral obligation to ensure their basic human rights are protected.
The article briefly mentions the cost of all this, but I'd like to know more. How much money are we spending on detention?
Oh, it's a lot. Building new detention centers, staffing them, providing medical care. It adds up really quickly.
And think about all the other things we could be doing with that money.
Right, like investing in programs that address the root causes of migration, or helping people immigrate legally.
It seems like we're focusing on the wrong things.
I think so.
Yeah.
We need to be smarter about how we approach this.
Not just tougher, but more strategic and humane.
Exactly. It's a complex issue, and it requires nuanced solutions.
I couldn't agree more.
It's about recognizing the humanity of the people involved and finding ways to manage migration in a way that's both effective and just.
Well said. This whole conversation has really been eye-opening.
It has, hasn't it?
But the article paints a pretty bleak picture.
Oh.
Overcrowding, controversial proposals, these plans for expansion. Where do we go from here? Is there any hope at all?
It's definitely a challenging situation, but I think there's always hope. Just the fact that these issues are being discussed is a good sign.
Okay, I see what you mean.
It means people are becoming more aware of the problems with ICE detention.
And awareness is the first step towards change.
Exactly.
So what can we do?
Well, there are lots of things. You can support organizations that work with immigrants and refugees.
Yep.
You can contact your elected officials and tell them you want to see changes in policy.
Good idea.
And most importantly, you can educate yourself and others about these issues, have conversations with people, share what you've learned.
So it's about recognizing our shared humanity and working together to find solutions.
That's it, exactly.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the human impact of all this. But there are still some things I want to explore in terms of the proposed solutions, like the idea of using Guantanamo Bay and this whole thing with collaborating with local law enforcement. Yeah. What are the implications of all that?
Yeah, those are definitely worth discussing in more detail.
Okay, let's start with Guantanamo. I have to admit that one really surprised me.
Me too.
What makes this proposal so controversial?
Well, Guantanamo has a really dark history. It's a place that's associated with human rights abuses and indefinite detention without due process.
Right.
So using it for immigration detention sends a really bad message.
It's like we're saying that immigrants are criminals who need to be locked away.
Exactly.
And the article mentions that this could face a lot of legal challenges.
Oh, definitely. There are already tons of lawsuits against ICE's detention practices, and this would just add fuel to the fire.
What kind of legal issues are we talking about?
Well, there are questions about whether detaining immigrants at Guantanamo would violate international law and whether it would go against the U.S. Constitution.
So not only is it ethically questionable, it might be illegal too.
Exactly.
It seems incredibly risky.
It is, and we have to remember that these are people who are just trying to find a better life. Many of them are fleeing violence and persecution.
Right.
To send them to Guantanamo, a place known for human rights abuses, would be horrible.
It's a terrifying thought. Okay, so let's talk about the other proposal, the one about partnering with local law enforcement agencies.
Okay.
What are the potential benefits and drawbacks there?
Well, on the plus side, it could make things more efficient. Local police are already out in the community. They know their areas better than ICE does.
Right.
So they could be helpful in finding and apprehending people who are here illegally.
But we talked earlier about how this could damage the trust between immigrant communities and the police.
Absolutely. If people are afraid that any interaction with the police could lead to deportation, they're going to be less likely to report crimes or to cooperate with investigations.
That's a double-edged sword.
It is. You want to enforce the law, but you don't want to create a climate of fear and mistrust.
And then there's the issue of racial profiling.
Oh, yeah, that's a big concern. If local police are working with ICE, there's a risk that they might start targeting people based on how they look, rather than on any actual evidence.
That's a scary thought.
It is. We have to be really careful about this. Enforcing immigration laws is important, but so is protecting the rights of all individuals.
That's a tough balance to strike.
It is. There are no easy answers when it comes to immigration.
This whole conversation has really highlighted that every solution seems to come with its own set of problems.
That's true of most complex social issues. It's important to have these conversations, though. to consider all sides and weigh the pros and cons.
I agree. This has been a really valuable discussion.
I think so too.
We've learned a lot about IC detention and the challenges of immigration enforcement.
We have.
But there's one more thing I want to talk about before we wrap up, and that's this whole idea of a border crisis. The article says that border crossings are actually down. So why are we hearing all this talk about a crisis? Welcome back to the show, everyone. Interesting, right? We hear all this talk about a border crisis, but then the article says that border crossings are at a 5-year low. So, how do we square those two things?
Yeah, it's definitely a disconnect, and I think it speaks to the power of narratives, The idea of a border crisis has taken hold in the public imagination, even if the data doesn't really support it.
So are you saying it's all just political rhetoric?
Well, it's definitely a factor. As we discussed earlier, the Trump administration has made immigration enforcement a big part of their platform. So there's a lot of pressure to be seen as tough on immigration, even if that means exaggerating the problem.
So they're basically playing to their base.
In a way, yes. They're appealing to voters who are concerned about immigration and who want to see stricter enforcement.
And that's why they're pushing for more detention and bigger facilities.
Exactly, even though the numbers don't necessarily justify it.
It's strange, though, right? You'd think they'd be happy that border crossings are down.
You would think. But for some people, it's not about the numbers. It's about sending a message.
What kind of message?
A message that the U.S. is not welcoming to immigrants, that we're going to detain anyone who tries to cross the border illegally, even if they're just seeking asylum.
So it's about deterrence.
Right. They believe that if we make things tough enough, people will stop coming.
But is that really effective?
Well, that's debatable. And it ignores the fact that many people who are crossing the border are fleeing violence and persecution. They're desperate, and they're not going to be deterred by the threat of detention.
It seems like a very short-sighted approach.
I think so. It's also incredibly expensive. As we talked about earlier, detention costs taxpayers a lot of money.
And it raises all sorts of ethical questions.
Exactly. Is this really how we want to treat people who are just looking for a better life?
So what are the alternatives?
Well, the article mentions a few. Things like community-based programs that provide support to immigrants, and legal aid organizations that help people navigate the immigration system.
So instead of just locking people up, we could be helping them.
Exactly. There are also groups that are advocating for policy changes, changes that would make our immigration system more humane and fair.
It's good to know that there are people working on this.
There are a lot of dedicated people out there who are fighting for a better way.
Well, this has been a really fascinating discussion.
It has.
I've learned a lot about IC detention and the complexities of immigration.
Me too.
What do you think is the most important takeaway for our listeners?
I think it's important to be critical thinkers. Don't just accept what you hear on the news or from politicians. Do your own research, look at the data, and most importantly, remember that this is about real people's lives.
That's a great point. Immigration is not just an abstract policy debate.
Exactly.
It affects real people in very real ways. And we need to remember that when we're talking about these issues.
I agree.
Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap things up.
Sounds good.
Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive.
It was my pleasure.
And thank you to all of our listeners for tuning in. I hope you found this conversation informative and thought-provoking. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep the conversation going.